afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's session, which will be Indo-Pakistan, Discourse, Dissent and Conformity. Our speakers today...
Thank you.
Our speakers today will be A.G. Noorani, Ashraf Jahangir Qazi, and Zafar Hilali. To moderate, we have Shahrukh Hassan, who will join us. Thank you. And the session will last for 60 minutes, at the end of which there will be a question and answer session. May I request that everyone can turn off their mobile phones, and I will welcome the speakers to the stage. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to what I'm sure will be a most interesting session on a subject which is of great importance, not just for Pakistan and India, but indeed for the entire region. Relations between India and Pakistan have had their ups and downs, and I think it would be fair to say that it's often been more a case of one step forward and several steps backwards. But recently, I think in the last 2-3 years, there have been steady development on a number of fronts. The near consensus between the business communities of the two countries to rigorously pursue trade and investment opportunities, the decision of the government of Pakistan to grant MFN status to India, the decision of the government of India to allow foreign direct investments from Pakistan, the agreement to sign a new relaxed visa regime, the reciprocal arrangement between the two state banks to allow two banks from each countries to operate in the others, in each country, and also the stepped up increase in communication at secretarial and ministerial level augurs very well for relations between India and Pakistan. Unfortunately, most of these agreements are not fully implemented. In fact, they've run into snags even before they could be implemented. But it shows a greater will and a greater sense of urgency on both sides of the border. In my humble opinion, as far as Pakistan is concerned, these decisions reflect and stem from several significant changes that have taken place in Pakistan. The first, and I'd like to stress the importance and significance of this change, is the consensus amongst all mainstream political parties of Pakistan that for the economic development and growth of Pakistan, normalization of relations and trade with India is inevitable. For that reason, I think Pakistan there's been a major change in the stance of Pakistan, which is that for the longest time, it has been the stance of the government of Pakistan that there must be what we call composite dialogue. That is to say that all contentious issues must be discussed simultaneously before there can be progress on discussions on trade, visa regime, cultural exchanges, and so forth. Pakistan has relented on that stand, and even without meaningful exchange on Kashmir and on Siachen and on other contentious issues, there has been development on trade and visa and cultural exchanges. Notwithstanding these developments, I think there are a lot of hurdles to be crossed, and we cannot remain unmindful of the vested interests inimical to peace on both sides of the border. To discuss the current relations between India and Pakistan, to analyze the progress made, and to clearly understand the many challenges that we still face, we have a wonderful panel with us today, and it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce the members of the panel to you. We have two outstanding former diplomats from Pakistan and a distinguished legal expert and scholar from India. They say that with diplomats, you never know whether they are dissenting or conforming. So I suppose in that context, the topic of today's discussion is quite appropriate. Diplomats can be doves as well as hawks. I don't know whether we have a dove and a hawk or two doves or two hawks. We will find out. But it is my privilege to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Zafar Hilali. Mr. Hilali is a former senior diplomat. He holds an LLB degree from King's College, London, and has held such key assignments as Special Secretary Foreign Affairs to the Prime Minister and Additional Foreign Secretary. He has served in various positions at Pakistan Mission to Sweden, Czechoslovakia, Washington, D.C., and the UN. He has served with distinction as Pakistan's ambassador to Yemen, Nigeria, and Italy. Since his retirement, Mr. Hilali has become well known as a political analyst and commentator on current affairs. He is also a prolific writer, contributing regularly to the Daily Express, the News, the Daily Times, and the weekly Friday Times. He also appears regularly in television talk shows. Our second panelist, Mr. Ashraf Jahangir Qazi, is also a former senior diplomat. Mr. Qazi has a degree in economics and has served as Pakistan's High Commissioner to India and as ambassador to the United States, China, Russia, the then East Germany, and Syria. He has held various diplomatic assignments in Copenhagen, Tokyo, Cairo, Tripoli, and London. In 2004, Mr. Qazi was appointed by the UN General Secretary, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, as Special Representative of the General Secretary in charge of the UN Assistance Mission in Iraq. In 2007, Mr. Qazi became UN's Special Representative in Sudan. Since 2011, he has been the Director General of the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad. Our third panelist is Mr. A.G. Noorani from India. Mr. Noorani is a distinguished legal expert and columnist specializing in constitutional law and history. His columns in Indian Express are well known. He is also a columnist for Frontier Line and for Dawn. Mr. Noorani has authored many books, including Jinnah and Tilak, India-China Boundary Problem, Constitutional Questions and Citizens' Rights, The Trial of Bhagat Singh, and Indian Trials. We are delighted to have a scholar of Mr. Noorani's stature, who is neither a diplomat nor a journalist and can therefore take a more academic and scholarly view of India-Pakistan relations. Mr. Noorani has an excellent sense of South Asian history and has followed India-Pakistan relations closely. He is one of those Indians who have kept their contacts with Pakistan and is hugely respected here. Gentlemen, welcome to the Karachi Literature Festival and to this session. I would like to invite each one of you to express your views on the subject for about 5 or 7 minutes each, and then we can have a discussion on your views and invite questions from the audience as well. May I request Mr. Hilali to go first?
I thought I'd come last, that's why I maneuvered myself. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Let me preface my remarks by saying that some of you will think this is a pretty dismal take on India-Pakistan relations, but that's what I believe. I think Pakistan and India have incompatible mutual obsessions. Ours, as we know, is Kashmir and security. But what rankles with India is that we are still on the map of the world. Pakistan was not just a mistake in Indian eyes, but an insult to the idea of India. Every so often, Pakistanis forget this and try to square the circle, like I did as a junior officer manning the India desk in the Foreign Office. I too felt that given a modicum of goodwill, India-Pakistan relations were fixable and not impossible to do. or jinxed. After all, Jinnah had said that he had wanted peace with India. In fact, he said that's the thing he hoped for most dearly. So why were these old fogies of the Foreign Office going on and on, I thought to myself, about India being the eternal enemy? So in my puny way, I determined to support moves for a better relationship with India and to speak out whenever those who mattered were within earshot. The first opportunity occurred in 1973 when I discovered myself in the presence of a foreign secretary, a former foreign secretary, who was then a powerful minister in the cabinet of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and our former ambassador to the United States. That one of them was my father, the second my uncle, and the third a dear friend of the family, made the occasion, in my view, very appropriate. So I made my pitch, saying in effect that having tried and failed to get anywhere with India by a policy of confrontation and conflict, perhaps we should try a more convivial and less abrasive approach. There was a stunned silence. None of them spoke for what seemed like ages. And when someone did, it was my father who told me to run along and get them some more ice. I also thought I heard the Foreign Secretary muttering something about the boy needing to grow up. The second opportunity came when I was with Benazir Bhutto in 1995 at an OIC summit in Casablanca. We had just finished making the rounds of the heads of state, and feeling pleased with her efforts, Bibi seemed in a receptive mood. So I started off by saying that if amity with India was not possible, perhaps managing differences more adroitly was a wise alternative, but that this required engaging India far more robustly than we were. Great, Bibi remarked. Now put it down in black and white, take it to them, and if they let you out of the room in one piece, come and tell me their response. Meanwhile, I'm off shopping. And that was that. But I persisted nevertheless. I dropped this in-your-face approach in favor of a more indirect one. I also tried drumming up support. I knew the arch hawk in the cabinet, the second Benazir cabinet and head of the Parliamentary Kashmir Committee was Nawabzada Nasrullah Khan, who had a soft spot for me. His other failing was that he could not be separated for long from his hookah. So after he had settled down in his hotel room in New York, where we had all assembled prior to the UN General Assembly session, and lit the hookah, I barged in to say my piece. Midway through my soliloquy, I noticed the Nawabzada was puffing away with unusual gusto. And a little later, smoke was billowing out not only from his mouth, but I swear from his ears too. When suddenly the door burst open. It was the hotel supervisor. Apparently the Nawabzada's hookah had set off the hotel's smoke alarm, and we all had to rush out. I thanked my stars, and I decided never to tempt fate again. Instead of rushing in, but I thought to myself, instead of rushing in where angels fear to tread, perhaps I should have asked why Jinnah, who was about as irreligious and a secular man that you could find anywhere, and who, savored his chota peg in the evenings, suddenly had a change of heart, so much so that he preferred, in his own words, the moth-eaten, truncated Pakistan to remaining within India. Or better still, why my father thought nothing of leaving a score of family homes in a street named after his father in Bangalore, which by the way still exists, in exchange for a small rickety abode in Karachi, and especially when in Bangalore at least, there was little Hindu-Muslim animosity, quite unlike other places in India. Anyway, it was only when I was thrown into the scrap heap that most retirees are and began reading intensively that the penny dropped. And it occurred to me that the old fogies of the Foreign Office may have been right after all. They had roomed and schooled with their Indian counterparts. They had gone to college with them. They knew them. They understood them. And nevertheless, were convinced that Muslims under Hindu majority rule had no future. To pull along as one nation to them was out of the question. Were they all mistaken, I asked myself? Surely not. Consider this. Consider what I subsequently read. And these are the words of Jaswant Singh, who I believe at least was among the better lot of Indian foreign ministers. See what he confided to Strobe Talbot privately during their extended conversation in the mid-90s. And this is much before all this, much before most of this jihadi stuff had come to the fore. He said, and I quote, "We are born of the same womb. However, from the moment of its birth, Pakistan has gone terribly wrong and permanently wrong. Pakistan is a relatively small, incurably troubled and incorrigibly troublesome state that dreamed of parity with India it would never attain or deserve." And again, Kashmir was closed history, and this is his words, and a case study in the fraught history of Pakistan. It was not fitting as a topic for international diplomacy. Pakistan's fixation with Kashmir should be understood as an objectification of Pakistan's predicament as a lost soul among nations, an ersatz country whose founder's only real legacy was a permanent reminder of what a tragic mistake partition had been. And finally, this is all quotes, almost all quotes. No one had had as much experience with Islam as India. India knew how to deal with Pakistan, and although he doesn't say so, presumably Islam, and America must work with India in waging our common struggle against these forces. Talbot writes, and I quote again, "Although I agreed with much of what Jaswant said, namely that partition was a huge and tragic mistake, I am at a loss to understand how an indictment of Pakistan's origin and a presumption of guilt about Pakistan's every move could possibly help India dealing with Pakistan." Precisely. But Jaswant wasn't really bothered about that. India doesn't really care whether it gets on with Pakistan. In India's view, Pakistan is an illegitimate state, a bastard nation, and an illegitimate state, an illegitimate heir, can have no rights to the patrimony of his forebears, and certainly not in preference to that of the legitimate successor, which is Bharat. Viewed thus, it seems unrealistic to believe that we can achieve anything more than a modus vivendi with India in the foreseeable future. And
One
perhaps
more minute,
not,
Mr. Hilali. Just one.
I'm finishing. And perhaps not even then, if our internal decay shows no signs of abating and the prospect of us fracturing further increases. India will want to wait and see what kind of an entity or entities will replace Pakistan. Meanwhile, the stronger and higher the walls between us, neighbors, the better for all concerned, and ironically, the better neighbors we will make. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hilali. May I now request Qazi Saab to express his views?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much. It's a yes, sorry. So I can turn my head around to see the audience properly. Hello? Hello? Is it on? Okay. Put it up here. Okay. Permanently fixed. The subject is India-Pakistan discourse. Conformity and dissent, designed to confuse all of us as to what it exactly means. Is it Indo-Pakistan negotiations and the state at which they are today, or is it something broader, more profound that escapes most of us? When we talk about discourse and India-Pakistan, I take it to mean largely the discourse that takes place in India and in Pakistan about the other country, rather than between each other, because then you get a fuller picture of what is happening. And similarly, conformity and dissent I regard as something with regard to the dominant discourse in India about Pakistan, and in Pakistan about India. And that, of course, impacts on the talks between the two countries on various subjects. But the state of negotiations, the manner in which they take place, and the rate at which they make progress or fail to make progress is a function of the kind of discourse that exists. I think Zafar has already very eloquently stated the kind of elements you find in the discourse. In Pakistan, we can say some of the elements are that India was opposed to the very creation of Pakistan. India simply doesn't recognize the legitimacy of Pakistan. India is the eternal adversary, enemy. It has never forgiven us for being responsible for tearing a separate country out of the womb of Bharat Mata, etc. Their current attempts are to isolate Pakistan, denuclearize it, portray it in the most negative of terms. The Kashmir issue is also seen to be an issue only insofar as Pakistan creates trouble in the valley and indulges in cross-border terrorism. Otherwise, the matter has been resolved by the accession of Kashmir to India. Pakistan only remains in occupation of parts of India. Much of India's military forces are mobilized and deployed vis-à-vis Pakistan rather than China, etc. Those are some of the elements in the dominant discourse that we find in Pakistan about India. And in India regarding Pakistan as an unnatural entity, a product of the elite classes that didn't want to face the consequences of the reforms promised by Congress, a creation in some ways of British imperialism in order to carry out their strategic interests after an independent India takes place or comes into its existence, a Praetorian feudal structure. All of these are very negative stereotypes about each other. in some respects, mirror images of each other with differences because India is the larger country, so you have the larger, smaller country syndrome also. But the one common characteristic about the dominant narrative in India about Pakistan and the dominant narrative in Pakistan about India is that they are zero-sum. Progress with regard to one is at the expense of progress with regard to the other. There are elements of truth, no doubt about it, and I think Zafar has pointed that out, that these are the products of historical experience, both Indian experience and Pakistani experience. So for narratives to be credible, they are rooted in reality, but not wholly, partially only. They are to a much greater extent embedded in a universe in which the larger part of the fabric is woven from exaggeration, distortion, fears, and the interests of dominant groups. And they clash, these major perspectives, but they do not connect with each other. There's a thesis, an antithesis, but they don't produce a synthesis. They are sterile. And that is why the relationship between India and Pakistan, while dangerous, has never been constructive, has never been fertile. And this will remain the situation as long as the dominant discourse is discourse of the elite in both countries. It is only when subordinate, dissenting discourses in both countries begin to shape and modify the dominant discourse that other voices now suppressed will begin to be heard, and room for constructive engagement will increase despite the real issues that need to be resolved. Kashmir is a problem. Kashmir, to a large extent, is rooted in Indian obstruction and obduracy. But Pakistan must see its interests not in just accusing India, which may be justified, but in serving the interests of its own people, which is to bring about development and transformation, which will require massive investment in human resources and infrastructure, including foreign investment, which will never take place in a state of confrontation with a neighbor that is 7 times your size and which attracts foreign investment on a huge scale. So if you are really committed to your own people, you will begin to see that the proper discourse does not lie in exclusive discourses or in zero-sum discourses, but discourses that address the concerns of the adversary and seek new ways of trying to sort of bring about movement by developing constituencies of sympathy, of interest. If we could build trade between our two countries, which now is languishing officially at something over 2 billion, and if we take informal trade into consideration, it's no more than 6 billion. If we were to increase what can be achieved in the next 10 years, $25 billion is not a problem. The amount of the constituencies which will make a good living and therefore will exercise considerable influence in the capitals of the two countries on behalf of peace and engagement, you will have a much greater absorptive capacity with regard to incidents that take place from time to time. Today, you see an incident which takes place jeopardizes the entire structure of engagement. That is untenable. That is a non-serious attitude. That is something which reflects, unfortunately, the interests of groups which seem to see their interests fed by perpetual hostility between the two countries, even though there are historical reasons that explain and to some extent even justify negative perceptions. And our best writings take place in advocacy of these views. but we need to dissent from these views in order to have a future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Qazi Saab, for an eloquent evaluation of what Pakistan needs to do for itself. May I now request Nurani Saab to express his views.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll address myself to the subject of the discussion, namely the Indo-Pak discourse rather than Indo-Pak relations and the role of dissent. That is extremely important because it's my central thesis that dissent is almost absent. It is there, but the dissent consists in saying we should be tougher with Pakistan or we should be tougher with India. I regard that dissent important and constructive, which reaches out to the other side. I believe in the old-fashioned diplomacy, which seeks a reconciliation of interests. And that is possible only if you recognize that somebody else has an interest as legitimate as your own. The trouble with the Indo-Pak relations has been that we have one narrative which has been fostered by the state. We were born in estrangement, and on both sides, a crop of what I can only call court historians grew up. Industries grew up. There was a Nehru industry, Gandhi industry, Patel and Maulana Azad. And here a Jinnah industry grew up, and each fostered its own selective interpretation, and the documentation was also very selective. I'll explain to you what I mean when I presently cite one document. The result has been that we don't reach out, we don't try to understand, all right, this is what we believe. What do the other side believe in? Something is missing in Indo-Pak relations. It was very well put by our former president in his earthy Punjabi humor when a Pakistani diplomat sought him out at a reception and said, Gyani Zail Singh, Gyani ji, we have arrived at this agreement and that agreement, which our moderator mentioned. He said, that's all very well. Khambe lag gaye hain, taare lag gayi hain, bijli nahi hai. The lampposts, the posts have been put up, the wires have been connected, but there is no electricity. And I think it should be the endeavor of writers, media and academia. I'm speaking of media at a time when I know that the media, especially in my country, is gone haywire, completely haywire. I, for one, refuse to appear on TV. But let me give you the arithmetic of what I call aggression. Hardly anybody talks about, in my country, about Junagadh. Now the Junagadh thing, Sir Chimalal Setalvad attacked India for allowing Samaldas Gandhi to travel from Bombay to Junagadh to take over Junagadh. As far as the travel raid into Kashmir is concerned, even those Pakistanis who admit that there was a degree of state sponsorship, and that is undeniable, by the way, because documents have come out and there was litigation about the funds. But they said Qaid-e-Azam was not privy to it. I think that's a wrong interpretation. Because if you look at the Moody papers in the British Library, you know that Qaid-e-Azam was very much in the know. He didn't want to be involved in integrity. Nothing could have happened without Qaid-e-Azam's approval. Now at this point, Nehru, to my mind wrongly reasoned, very well, they wanted to get it by travel raid. They failed, now they wanted to get it by plebiscite. And he reckoned that if he lost the plebiscite, the Hindu right wing in his party would take over. He balked. And this is where the Pakistani friends are right. Nehru backed out of the plebiscite. But The Pakistani intellectuals, Pakistani writers do not reckon with the fact that right till 1951, the honors in obduracy were evenly divided. Both sides rejected the proposals, whether by the UN Commission for India and Pakistan, by Owen Dixon, right up to the time of Frank Graham in 1951. That's a fact. So you have this arithmetic of aggression, Junagadh obliterated, Kashmir obliterated. Now I come to 1965. It's there in the documents now, Altaf Gohar and many others, that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto advised President Ayub Khan, look, after the 62 war, the Indians are arming to the teeth, now is the time to strike. Now, we had made it very clear that an attack on Kashmir will be regarded as attack on India, and we will, even if it is a disputed territory, you have no right to use force. And India did the obvious thing, which Nehru had said way back in 51, when Liaquat showed the mailed fist. We marched down to Lahore. And what is happening? 6th December is celebrated, observed here, ours is celebrated as Defense Day. Now, pursuing this as objectively as I can, on Bangladesh, the Indian narrative is Pakistan started the war on 3rd December. I think that's utter nonsense. The war was started by India when Indian armor marched into East Pakistan on 21st November. Then you have B.K. Nehru's memoirs. He was then governor of Assam, and he was told by an army officer in the region that had Pakistanis not helped us by attacking us, we would have had to attack them the next day. So you have this kind of a thing. Now it was the same about the covert military operation in Kashmir. I take a dim view of it and yet a cool view of it. The Pakistani leaders of the time, Ziaul Haq, felt, well, look, we have got the nuclear weapon, there's a parity, let's foster this. And M.A. Niazi of Nations said even war was reckoned with. It was a report from Muzaffarabad. Now, look at it from the Indian side. Why should we go to the negotiating table kicking and screaming? However, this is where the Pakistan Benazir Bhutto government made a fatal mistake. Diplomacy without the backing of force is impotent. But force which is unrelated to an achievable political purpose is sterile. The non-papers which the Pakistani government presented in 2004 were surrender terms. Had the government of Pakistan proposed something of the kind that Musharraf crafted, we would have had some progress. However, that's so much for the relation. The trouble is that in none of the discourses do you find any of these nuances that we could have been wrong. And I have my favorite quotation of George Kennan, that if you recognize your own faults, the iniquity of the opponent is also impaired. I think it's the task of the intellectuals to do this, but of this I'm afraid there is very, very little sign. There are writers like Professor Joya Chatterjee, who has written excellently on the partition of Bengal and showed how it came about. There was the favorite phrase of Aisha Jalal that the South Indian scholars prize the badge of patriotism over the privilege of scholarship. And that is what is lacking. I think I read a column by Khalid Ahmad, who has been a participant in the so-called track to diplomacy. There's nothing track to about it. They said people talk like government delegates. Now, if this is the thing, the prospect would be bleak. But fortunately, I see in Pakistan signs of people who are prepared to reach out, who are prepared to understand. And there are, I assure you, people in India who are prepared to do that. Otherwise, my writings would not have been published. My writings would not have been published. My views on Kashmir, as Mr. Qazi Ashraf Bhai will tell you, are diametrically opposed to those of the official narrative. I believe that this kind of dissent alone will help us. And I do not believe that the damage done by history is irreparable. I think considerable progress was made, considerable progress can be made, provided that you foster this kind of independent scholarship. You try to reach out to the other side and realize that eventually it's a clash of interests, and those interests are preeminently reconcilable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Noorani. We would now welcome questions. My request is for you to identify yourself. Please keep the questions brief and indicate who the question is addressed to. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Akhlaq Ahmed. I would like to just ask one simple question. In all the deliberations that we had with India, we had never involved the third party in our deliberations. What is the answer to that? Number one. Number two, I think India and Pakistan cannot resolve their disputes, although they are both nuclear, and they have a fear, of course. In my opinion, United States of America, Russia, China, these countries, if they can play a role in resolving this issue, maybe it is possible. When these foreign powers force these governments, both Pakistan and India, to come to a settlement, then a settlement may be obtained. Otherwise, I don't think. So what is your impression about that, Mr. Noorani, Mr. Shahi?
Perhaps
my
a
question.
quick
Thank
word
you.
by all three panelists.
My friends, some of the most significant progress in Indo-Pak discourse was arrived at from 2003 onwards, when President Musharraf realized the folly of Kargil, and I'm afraid because of domestic politics and the Indian distrust of him after Kargil and hate in some circles, people have not given him his due. I did a clerk's job of tabulating his utterances. He was grouping. For example, Ashraf Bhai was High Commissioner then. He was present at that breakfast meeting at Agra, and the media went to town that he was aggressive at breakfast. 3 years later, Shekhar Gupta, the editor of Express, said he made concessions there which no Pakistani leader had made before. I wish my friend Shekhar had said it at that time, but he didn't. But the point was that he began with the basics. Here is a dispute. Let us meet. So we have met here now, he said. Now let us negate, he said, used the word he used, and let us arrive at it. The 4 points was not a cut and dry thing. He groped towards it. I know that there are people in Kashmir and in Pakistan who want to fall in love with Vajpayee, and they are very welcome to do that. But let me remind you that it was the Vajpayee government who rejected even the modest autonomy resolution of the Kashmir Assembly. And of course, the Agra summit was wrecked by L.K. Advani. And what is more, uniquely in the annals of diplomacy, a visiting statesman was abused by the Prime Minister, Vajpayee, and the Foreign Minister, Jaswant Singh, not Advani, days about his English, his demeanor, and the rest. But Agra, that formula, was excellent. It would not have settled it. It would have set a format. Musharraf didn't lose heart. He crafted it. Now, there, for the first time, he found a partner in Dr. Manmohan Singh. Manmohan Singh, there are Indians who say, oh, he's wedded to empower. He said, we have to do something about this. As he said once, to chalte hi rahega, kuch karke jaye. And together they met. For example, it was Manmohan Singh who said, the LOC should be made irrelevant. And that is how they together they crafted these 4 point plans. Now, is a native achievement, why do you want to bring the Americans?
Thank
read
you.
how-
Naren Saab, would you also comment on the question, on that part of the question which asks why third-party mediation is not welcomed or invited by both
Because
parties?
we have done excellently without them. And what have the third parties done so far? We have done excellently without it, sir. If it was not for the Bombay blasts, Manmohan Singh would have been here. If it was not for the train blast in July 2006, but despite the Bombay blast, things were progressing. In 2007, it was the domestic turmoil here. Manmohan Singh was all set to come here in May 2007.
Thank you very much.
The 4 points are ready.
Would either Hilali Saab or Qazi Saab like to also comment?
Just very briefly say that as far on the 8 points of the Pakistan-India agenda, basically we are quite willing to talk with each other bilaterally, but we want naturally international friendly pressure on India on issues on which there's no progress, and that's natural. But the only issue on which we do believe there should be a third party is on Kashmir itself, where the Kashmiris are the primary party affected by the situation and the primary party who are the subject of the UN resolutions which are still valid. The fact of the matter is that India will not allow this because India regards Kashmir as an integral part of India, and therefore India represents Kashmir. We may not accept it, but you won't get a tripartite format for the discussion of this subject. Otherwise, yes, the bilateral format in conjunction with international and regional and other diplomacy should be able to see progress. But one of the problems of Pakistan has been that we've always sought external equalizers to address the problem of imbalance of power between Pakistan and India. And that, of course, has always been a hopeless endeavor. It's never really led to an outcome satisfactory to us. And we've always forgotten the fact that the answer to the problem of imbalance when you're talking differences with a larger neighbor is to maximize your options through development and transformation at home, not through diplomatically trying to lure external parties into your bilateral discourse.
Thank you very much.
I'll just add that he's absolutely correct. I think what you are not, you cannot pose to be. This state is seen as a state in economic meltdown. It's a fractured state. And every day there is news that Pakistan, frankly, people think is disintegrating. So I think, why should you as an Indian, why should you really bother too much until the situation settles? And I think they are therefore backing off. Because the one evidence of that is really this Sir Creek. I don't think many people know anything about Sir Creek here. But let me tell you, that in 1840, I think the division between Kutch and Sindh had been done by the British, and we'd accepted all the old distinctions of districts and boundaries that the British handed over to us. And suddenly out of the blue now, the Indians were not out of the blue immediately, but the Indians have this Thalweg principle that they take a stream, which isn't really a stream even, it keeps wandering all the time, and they want a mid-distance. So why don't you take the 1840 boundary, settle this, and move ahead? But they don't want to do it. Why concede property? Why concede territory? Why concede anything to a state that may not be there? I mean, this seems to be the kind of thing that is now taken over. And it's very, very sad, I think, that that's happened.
Thank you. Yes. Lady over there.
I had a question down here.
Just 1 second. After this lady here in the front.
In the spirit of a dissenting discourse from a Pakistani, although we are a democratic country, we are a security state. Hence, the relationship that we have with our neighbor, in this case India, I would say is actually unclear that those who purport this foreign policy or defense policy are actually representing the wishes of this country or the population of this country. If you look at the Baloch and their relationship with India, or the frontier and the population with India, or with Sindh, there's only one province which has a very strong history as a result of partition, which has a problem with India. So as a Pakistani, I don't think fundamentally in the democratic spirit, we have as many problems with India as the state publicly purports. How do we change that within Pakistan so we can actually negotiate with our neighbors both east and in west democratically?
Thank you. Who would you like to answer this question?
It doesn't matter.
Zafar Saab?
Happens to be my daughter who's
The key words that I didn't get key words.
I think but that the national discourse is not as national as it pretends to be.
No, she's absolutely correct. I mean, the rest of the provinces think this is a matter for the Punjab. And she's right. Why do they feel dragooned into it? But the fact is that after 65 years, I think now a consensus has built up over Kashmir. And it doesn't really matter whether the army and the military people go and botch it up. What is really there, it appeals to the fair-mindedness of Pakistanis, is that, look, here are our people who want a voice in their future, and it had been agreed, etc., etc. They're convinced now that India has gone back on its promise, and now let them have this voice. I think they might not be prepared to fight and go to war over it in the other provinces, but certainly that feeling is there that they are being hard done by. Secondly, I would like to say one thing. I don't really think, frankly, Ashraf, with you, I don't buy all this business about the elite and the masses. I think, quite frankly, the masses are far crueler than the elite could have ever imagined anybody to be. And why is it that these very masses keep on electing extremists into office? I'm talking about India particularly. Why is the BJP, offshoot of the RSS, now said to be harboring terrorist groups by their own foreign minister, who have done the Ayodhya, done the other thing, now were responsible for the Samjhota Express? Why does the masses, if the masses are the fount of all wisdom, why do they keep electing these people? Because frankly, the masses aren't. And I recall one thing that Liaquat said to Nehru before or at the time of partition or just after partition. He said to him, look, you and I are neighbors. We've lived next to each other. We know each other. We know how we live and how we think. We have a problem. Let's you and I sit and solve it. Because if you leave it to succeeding generations, they'll never be able to do it because they'll grow distant and further apart. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that.
Mr. Javed Jabbar would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My compliments to Zafar Hilali, Jahangir Ashraf Qazi and A.G. Nurani Saab and the moderator for very incisive and thought-provoking presentations. My question is a concern. While like all people, one welcomes the breakthroughs in trade, one submits that unless the classically defined core issues are addressed, we will have a situation here which is today occurring in East Asia, where you have unprecedented bonds of economic growth and cross-border investments. South Korea, Japan, China. But the moment there is a territorial issue, the polarization of tension virtually negates the momentum. Trade remains, of course, investment remains, but there are real dangers today of conflict where trade was supposed to be the great alleviator. One would appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
I would completely agree with Mr. Javed Jabbar. And I'm one of those who believe that Kashmir has always been the core issue. And unless the Kashmir dispute is settled, we do not expect any progress on other fields. If only there is progress on Kashmir, you will find progress on people-to-people contact, on trade, and this is exactly what happened when the dialogue process, Manmohan Singh came to office in 2004, picked up speed, and you had this thing. However, here I must sound a caveat that Saif Hareki, the tripartite things, if you have the Kashmiris leaders on the same table, the Tower of Babel will seem by comparison a very organized assembly. In 2006, the Kashmiri leaders came to Pakistan. They, let alone exchange greetings, they didn't exchange even smiles at each other. Yasin Malik and Maulvi Farooq, they walked pace. Gilani doesn't agree with Abdul Ghani Bhatt, whom we had elected as chairman. The Kashmiri leaders are at 6s and 7s. Now, this myth that they represent Kashmir must be exploded. There is alienation among the people. They express that alienation. It's the people who lead them. And what was their leadership? Hartal, Band, enormous economic hardship inflicted on the people. Only now they are coming to their senses. They have rejected all advice about peaceful demonstrations and they have gone by the road. And believe me, there are lots of question marks about the finances I do not wish to go into. But the Kashmiri leaders, at the same time, if there is the route to Kashmir settlement lies between India and between Islamabad and New Delhi, not bring in Srinagar eventually. And let me remind you, I've studied the peace process in South Tyrol, Northern Ireland. In each case, those leaders were elected. They were elected. In Northern Ireland, the British passed an act, Entry into Negotiations Forum Act. And the leaders were elected to the forum and that's how the negotiations took place.
Thank you.
These people don't want to fight elections.
Thank you, Nurani Saab. Qazi Saab, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, very briefly, I'm not sure that I understood Javed Jabbar clearly. Were you saying that trade, etc., should or should not be tied with Kashmir?
I was saying that unless core issues are also resolved,
Yes.
trade by itself cannot transform.
Yes, understood. I would only partially go along with that. I would say that unless there is progress on the core issues towards an eventual solution, which would ultimately be acceptable by and large to all three parties, and I'm not suggesting that you get a cackling bunch of people who disagree with each other. I'm talking in principle that if you're discussing a core issue such as Kashmir, you have to find a format. It may not be any one kind of format. It may be an evolving series of negotiations which allow the main parties, India, Pakistan, the Kashmiris over whom the issue is, to participate in it. They should be accepting of the ultimate outcome. Now, unless you make significant progress there, normalization will be limited. But normalization should not be impossible, because normalization itself will increase the space, the attitudes, which will in turn facilitate progress on the core issue. It's a long process, but I do not think issues like trade should be directly connected with issues like Kashmir. Ultimately, the tie does work. They would slow down the thing. And if there's absolutely no movement from India, then the hawkish sentiment will build up in Pakistan, which will then, outweigh those who wish to engage. So trade should be connected with trade. For instance, the MFN question, which has got all this political context in Pakistan. If you want to tie it with something, you should tie it with the non-tariff barriers in India, which even if you grant MFN to India, and India has granted MFN to Pakistan, access of Pakistani exports to India is hampered not by the existence or lack of existence of MFN, which does exist. India has granted MFN, but by the non-tariff barriers which impact on other countries which have given MFN to India. So we should be careful and wise in what we tie things with. Ultimately, core issues will impact on the overall state of affairs, but let's not tie it at every level, otherwise you'll have no progress at all, and you will never create an ambience or an atmosphere in which you can move on difficult issues.
There was a gentleman at the back who wanted to ask a question.
Hello. Sir, I am Moin Bakshi. I want to ask one question from Bilavli Saab. Sir, my question is that startingly in Pakistan, the GM Sayyid doctrine and Khan Ghaffar Khan doctrine has played vital role in the normal relationship between India and Pakistan. What are the reasons behind? Why are you ignored to them? It's my question. Okay, sir.
Who did you indicate he wanted to? Okay, Nurain Saab. Quick answers. We'll take 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up.
There is one more question, sir.
Just a
I'm
second.
Rashid Masood Alam. There's
Just a second.
growing perception in Pakistan that
let-
Pakistan administration and establishment is bowing down before India, and we are doing much more than expected or required to be done in order to normalize the relationship. While on the other part of the border, the same is not being reciprocated by the Indian establishment.
Thank you very
being
much.
It,
We'll take the first
whatever,
question first,
I mean,
and then we'll come to this.
Contribution of GM Sayyid Sahib and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, but I may be dense, but its relevance to Indo-Pak discourse escapes me.
Thank you. Wajid Jawad Sahib wanted to ask a question. Could we have the mic over here, please? Right here. We'll just take 2 more questions. Wajid Sahib, and there was a gentleman here.
I have a comment and a question. My comment is that the young lady from this side had said that, in that democratic discourse, probably Kashmir is only Punjab related. That is not true. You know what Qaid-e-Azam said, and the Pathans who took part in the struggle in Kashmir and campaigned by Mr. Zaid Bhutto. Well, I can say the same thing. South of India is not so much pushed about Kashmir.
South Asia volume. Then in November 1950, President Ayub Khan, Foreign Minister Manzoor Qadir said, plebiscite is the agreed formula. If the other side has an alternative, let it offer it. I think that was very reasonable. And in the Zulfikar Ali Bhutto Soran Singh talks, there was no talk of plebiscite. It was straight horse trading. The name of the game was drawing an international boundary in Kashmir. So much for plebiscite. In 2000, why are we quarreling with success? We achieved significant proposal. The non-papers were exchanged. If it was not for the political tsunami here in March 2007, by now Kashmir would have been settled. Then what happened? Unfortunately, there was the Bombay blast 2008. So that harmed the process. Remember, for this, Manmohan Singh has received less credit than is due. The man struggled within the government, which had some hawks, within his own party, within the country. And after the Bombay blast, his hands were tied up. Even now, it is not too late to pursue them. And my advice to the Kashmiris has been, for God's sake, put your shoulder to the wheel and espouse the 4-point formula.
Thank you. Last question. This gentleman in the yellow shirt.
Amir Sahib.
Okay, just quick question and a quick answer.
Amir Sahib.
Sir, this gentleman.
Sir, my name is Mohammed Naeem. I would like to Mr. Professor Hilali and Mr. Hilali. For the last 58 years since I was born, I've been hearing about Kashmir. Thank you. Thank you. But I would like to know how many Kashmiris want to join Pakistan. I have not heard any of them on the TV or anyone saying that they want to be a part of Pakistan. If you go to Mirpur or Kotli or somewhere, they ask you, have you come from Pakistan?
Thank you. A quick answer and we wrap.
Yeah, you're quite right, actually. I went on a duck shoot once to Kashmir, and I was given a guard of honor by the Kashmir police. So I said to this policeman, thank you very much for this guard of honor. I'm sorry I'm in this dress, kind of dress I am. I've never inspected a guard of honor dressed so badly. But where are you going for your holidays? So he said, I'm going to Pakistan for my holidays. Now, I was a bit taken aback, but he was technically right. Yes, indeed. I think if they had their way, they'd be independent and be rid of both of us, frankly.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think the time is done and the organizers we need to vacate this hall for the next session. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ahmed, he's been asking for questions.
Okay, because Mr. Noorani has requested, please.
I asked the same question as Arundhati Roy asked. Arundhati Roy had asked the question that it is India which needs freedom from Kashmir. What is your comment on that?
Actually, I think both of us want freedom from the dispute. If we have a freedom from the dispute, maybe Kashmir will profit and so will we both.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful articulation of all the concerns between India and Pakistan. I think I'd like to echo what Qazi Saab said, that for us Pakistanis, we need to determine what is in our best interest and then develop policies that serve those interests best. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the speakers. May I ask everyone to vacate the room unless you're staying for the next session, which will start shortly. Thank you.